The National Security Agency had a mathematics problem in 1956, and it was drowning them. Every day, listening posts from Turkey to Alaska intercepted thousands of Soviet radio transmissions, diplomatic cables, military orders, intelligence communications, all encrypted with codes that human analysts couldn't break fast enough to matter. By the time a team of cryptologists worked through a single day's worth of messages, 3 more days of intercepts had piled up. The backlog grew like a tumor. The Soviets were using increasingly sophisticated cipher systems, many based on one-time pad principles that mathematicians considered theoretically unbreakable. Each message was encrypted with a unique key that would never be reused, creating what should have been perfect security. American cryptologists could stare at these encrypted texts for weeks and extract nothing useful. The advantage the United States had held during World War II, when codebreakers regularly read enemy communications, was slipping away. Inside NSA's headquarters at Fort Meade, Maryland, the workload had become absurd. Rows of mathematicians sat at desks covered with intercept printouts, working through statistical frequency analysis by hand. They used pencils, graph paper, and mechanical calculators that could barely multiply 2 numbers without jamming. A single encrypted message might require 40 hours of human analysis, and even then, success wasn't guaranteed. The agency's director, Lieutenant General Ralph K9, knew they were losing ground. Soviet communications security was improving faster than American code-breaking capability. The intelligence value of an intercepted message decreased exponentially with time. Knowing what Moscow told its ambassador yesterday was useful. Knowing what they told him 6 months ago was trivia. NSA needed to break codes in hours, not weeks. William Friedman, the agency's chief cryptologist and the man who had broken Japan's purple cipher during World War II, thought he saw a solution. The problem wasn't human intelligence. NSA employed some of the brightest mathematical minds in America. The problem was speed. Human brains, no matter how gifted, could only process patterns so fast, but machines could search through millions of possible decryption keys in the time it took a person to test one. Friedman had been following developments in electronic computing. ENIAC, the first general-purpose electronic computer, had demonstrated in 1945 that machines could perform calculations thousands of times faster than humans. By 1956, companies like IBM were selling commercial computers to businesses and universities. But those machines were designed for accounting, scientific calculation, and data processing, general-purpose tools that could do many things adequately, but nothing exceptionally well. What Friedman envisioned was different. A computer built specifically for cryptanalysis, not a machine that happened to be capable of code-breaking among its many functions, but a purpose-built system whose every circuit and component was optimized for attacking encrypted communications. The architecture would be specialized, the instruction set tailored, the processing pathways designed around the mathematical operations cryptologists actually needed. He needed someone to build it, someone who understood both the mathematics of cryptanalysis and the emerging possibilities of electronic computing, someone willing to work in absolute secrecy on a project that might never receive public recognition. In early 1956, Friedman began looking for that person. Leo Rosen wasn't looking for government work when William Friedman found him. At 31 years old, he was a rising mathematician at Princeton, specializing in number theory and algebraic structures, the kind of pure mathematics that existed entirely on chalkboards and had no obvious practical application. He'd earned his doctorate in 1952 studying abstract problems about prime numbers and group theory. His colleagues knew him as quiet, methodical, more comfortable with equations than people. Friedman contacted him through back channels in early 1956. The approach was careful, indirect. Would Rosen be interested in consulting on a classified mathematics problem? Nothing specific could be discussed until he obtained security clearance. The work would require relocating to Maryland. The salary would be adequate. The problem itself was significant. Rosen was curious enough to go through the clearance process. By June 1956, he sat across from Friedman in a windowless office at Fort Meade, learning that the National Security Agency existed, something most Americans didn't know, and that it employed more mathematicians than any university in the world. Friedman explained the intercepted Soviet communications, the encryption systems NSA couldn't break, the backlog that kept growing. Then he explained what he wanted, a machine that could crack codes. The idea appealed to Rosen in ways Friedman probably didn't anticipate. This wasn't just an engineering challenge or a patriotic duty. This was applied number theory on a scale that had never been attempted. The mathematical operations involved in cryptanalysis, modular arithmetic, pattern matching across enormous datasets, statistical analysis of symbol frequencies. These were precisely the kinds of calculations that could be optimized if you designed hardware specifically for them. Rosen accepted the position in July 1956 with one condition. He would have complete control over the system's architecture. He wouldn't adapt commercial computers to cryptanalysis. He would build something new from the ground up. Friedman agreed. NSA gave Rosen a budget, a small team of engineers, and a basement facility where they could work without interference. His first decision surprised everyone. IBM had been trying to sell NSA their latest 704 computer, a powerful general-purpose machine that could perform 40,000 operations per second. It was the fastest commercial computer available in 1956, and IBM's salesman insisted it could handle any computational task NSA needed. Rosen rejected it outright. The IBM 704 was designed to be versatile. It could run scientific simulations, process business transactions, solve differential equations, manage databases. But that versatility came at a cost. Its architecture couldn't be optimized for any single task. Cryptanalysis required different capabilities than general computing. It needed to process streaming data continuously, test millions of possible decryption keys in parallel, and perform pattern matching operations that commercial computers couldn't handle efficiently. Rosen wanted specialized processors that did one thing extraordinarily well: attacking encrypted communications. He began sketching architectures that looked nothing like conventional computers. Instead of a single central processor executing instructions sequentially, he envisioned multiple parallel processors, each optimized for specific cryptanalytic operations. Instead of storing data in conventional memory, he wanted streaming systems that could process intercepts in real time as they arrived from listening posts. His team thought he was proposing something impossible. The electronic components needed to build such a system barely existed in 1956. Transistors were still expensive and unreliable. Most computers still used vacuum tubes. What Rosen was describing would require inventing new hardware from scratch. He didn't care. They would build it anyway. Rosen spent the last months of 1956 working out the architecture on paper. The machine he envisioned would operate fundamentally differently from anything IBM or Remington Rand was building. Commercial computers processed instructions one at a time, fetching data from memory, performing a calculation, storing the result, then moving to the next instruction. That sequential approach worked fine for accounting or scientific calculations, but cryptanalysis required something else entirely. Breaking encrypted communications meant testing hypotheses rapidly. A cryptologist attacking a Soviet cipher might need to try 10 million possible decryption keys to find the right one. On a conventional computer, that meant 10 million separate operations executed one after another, a process that could take days. Rosen wanted parallel processing, multiple circuits testing different keys simultaneously, narrowing possibilities through elimination rather than brute force sequential search. He also needed streaming architecture. Intercepted Soviet messages arrived continuously from listening posts, and they needed to be analyzed immediately, while the intelligence was still fresh. Conventional computers required loading data from punch cards or magnetic tape, processing it in batches, then outputting results. By the time you finished analyzing one batch, you were already behind on the next. Rosen wanted his machine to process intercepts as they arrived. in real time without the bottleneck of loading and storing data. The third requirement was specialized instruction sets. General-purpose computers wasted processing cycles on capabilities cryptanalysts never used: floating-point arithmetic, trigonometric functions, complex branching logic. Rosen wanted to strip all that out and replace it with operations tailored specifically for code breaking: modular addition, bitwise rotation, frequency analysis, pattern matching across massive text streams. If the hardware could only do cryptanalysis and nothing else, that was fine. It would do cryptanalysis better than any general-purpose machine ever could. By January 1957, he had preliminary designs. The system would use transistorized circuits instead of vacuum tubes. More reliable, faster, and they generated less heat. It would have multiple processing units working in parallel, each attacking different aspects of the same encrypted message. It would accept streaming input directly from communication intercept systems, and it would be purpose-built for one mission: breaking Soviet codes. Friedman brought the designs to NSA's Technical Review Board. The engineers were skeptical. What Rosen was proposing didn't look like a computer as they understood the term. It looked like something between a computer and a specialized electronic calculator. Several board members argued for buying proven IBM equipment instead of gambling on Rosen's experimental design. Friedman overruled them. He understood what Rosen was attempting. During World War II, the British had built Colossus, a special-purpose machine designed specifically to break German Lorenz cipher traffic. Colossus wasn't a general-purpose computer either, but it had given British cryptologists an enormous advantage because its specialized architecture could perform pattern-matching operations far faster than human analysts. Rosen was proposing the same philosophy: optimize the machine for the mission, not for versatility. NSA approved the project in March 1957. They gave Rosen expanded lab space, authorization to hire more engineers, and access to the agency's classified research on Soviet cipher systems. The machine needed a code name. Someone suggested SOLO, Special Online Operation, because it would be the first computer designed exclusively for cryptanalysis. The name stuck. Rosen's team began building the prototype that spring. They had no blueprint to follow. Every circuit board, every processing unit, every data pathway had to be designed from scratch. They were inventing a new category of computer, and they had no idea if it would work. The basement facility at Fort Meade, where Rosen's team assembled SOLO, looked more like an electronics repair shop than a computer laboratory. Workbenches covered with oscilloscopes, soldering irons, and half-built circuit boards lined the walls. Transistors arrived in boxes from Western Electric and had to be tested individually because the failure rate ran above 30%. Every component was custom-built. There were no instruction manuals, no technical support, no spare parts. When something didn't work, they redesigned it. Rosen divided his team into specialized groups. One focused on the parallel processing units, the circuits that would test multiple decryption keys simultaneously. Another worked on the streaming input system that would accept encrypted text directly from intercept stations. A third group tackled the pattern-matching hardware that could scan thousands of message fragments per second, looking for linguistic structures. By summer 1957, they had individual components working in isolation. Making them work together was harder. The first integration attempt in September 1957 failed completely. When they powered up the assembled system and fed it a test message encrypted with a simple substitution cipher, something a human cryptologist could break in an hour, SOLO produced gibberish. The parallel processors were generating conflicting results. The streaming input was dropping data. The pattern matching circuits were triggering on noise instead of actual linguistic patterns. Rosen spent a week troubleshooting before he found the problem: timing issues. The different processing units were operating at slightly different speeds, causing synchronization failures that corrupted the entire analysis. He redesigned the clock system to keep all processors synchronized. added buffer circuits to prevent data loss during streaming input, and recalibrated the pattern matching thresholds. By December 1957, they tried again. This time, Solo broke the simple substitution cipher in 12 minutes. Not fast by later standards, but faster than any human team could manage. More importantly, it worked. The architecture was sound. They spent early 1958 scaling up. More processing units, larger memory buffers, faster streaming capabilities. Rosen wanted Solo to handle real Soviet intercepts, not just academic test cases. That meant dealing with more sophisticated encryption systems, polyalphabetic ciphers, code systems that mixed letters with numbers, messages that used multiple encryption layers. Each new cipher type required custom circuits optimized for that specific mathematical operation. The breakthrough came in June 1958. NSA's listening posts in Turkey had intercepted several dozen Soviet diplomatic messages encrypted with a system that had resisted human cryptanalysis for months. The messages used a rotor-based cipher similar to the German Enigma, but with more complexity. 8 rotors instead of 3, irregular stepping patterns, and additional encryption layers. Friedman gave Rosen the intercepts and asked if Solo could handle them. Rosen's team loaded the encrypted text into Solo's streaming input, configured the parallel processors to test different rotor configurations simultaneously, and let the machine run. 72 hours later, Solo produced plain text. The decrypted messages revealed Soviet diplomatic communications about arms negotiations with Egypt. The intelligence was solid, verifiable, and timely enough to matter. That success convinced NSA leadership to fund the next phase. Solo had proven the concept. Now, Rosen needed to build a production version, larger, faster, more capable, a machine that could handle the full volume of Soviet communications NSA was intercepting daily. A machine that could process not just dozens of messages, but thousands. They would call it Harvest, and it would be the most powerful computer in the world. NSA authorized Harvest in October 1958 with a budget that would have funded a small aircraft carrier. Rosen's prototype had worked, but scaling it up meant solving problems that didn't exist in Solo's basement incarnation. The production system would need to be 50 times more powerful, processing intercepts from listening posts across 3 continents simultaneously. It would need redundancy, backup circuits that could take over when components failed. And it would need to run continuously, 24 hours a day for years without shutting down. Rosen partnered with IBM, but not in the way IBM expected. The company thought they were building a conventional computer with some custom features. Rosen made clear this was entirely custom hardware following his architecture, not IBM's. They would manufacture components to his specifications, period. IBM engineers who tried suggesting design modifications found themselves overruled. This was Rosen's machine. Construction began in 1959 at a secure facility in Maryland. The final system would occupy an entire room, 40 feet long, 20 feet wide, with circuit cabinets lining every wall. The core consisted of specialized streaming processors that could analyze encrypted text as it arrived from intercept stations without storing it first. Each streaming processor handled different cipher types, one optimized for rotor-based systems, another for code-based encryption, a third for polyalphabetic substitution ciphers. The parallel processing architecture Rosen had pioneered in Solo expanded dramatically. Harvest had 96 separate processing units that could work simultaneously on different aspects of the same encrypted message. While one unit tested possible rotor positions, another analyzed letter frequency distributions, a third searched for linguistic patterns, and others explored statistical anomalies. The system could test 3 million decryption hypotheses per second, a capability no commercial computer could match. Weight became an issue. The final system topped 7,000 pounds, not counting power supplies and cooling equipment. The transistorized circuits generated so much heat that Harvest required dedicated air conditioning running year-round. Power consumption hit 75 kilowatts, enough to light a small neighborhood. Fort Meade had to upgrade electrical infrastructure just to supply the machine. By late 1961, Harvest was operational. The system could process 12,000 intercepted messages per day, analyzing each one against known Soviet cipher systems and flagging anything that showed cryptographic weakness. The streaming architecture meant intercepts arriving from Turkey, Alaska, or Germany went directly into Harvest's processors without human intervention. Cryptologists only saw messages the machine flagged as potentially breakable. The target Rosen focused on was Soviet one-time pad systems. In theory, one-time pads were unbreakable, each message encrypted with a unique random key that would never be reused. But Soviet cipher clerks made mistakes. They sometimes reused pad sheets they thought had been destroyed. They occasionally copied keys incorrectly, introducing patterns. They transmitted messages at predictable times using predictable formats. These human errors created mathematical vulnerabilities that Harvest could detect. Rosen designed special circuits that hunted for pad reuse. The machine compared every new intercept against a database of previously intercepted messages, looking for statistical correlations that indicated the same encryption key had been used twice. When it found potential matches, it applied differential cryptanalysis, comparing the two messages to extract the underlying key. This worked because XORing two messages encrypted with the same key canceled out the key, leaving only the relationship between the two plaintexts. By March 1962, Harvest was breaking Soviet diplomatic communications regularly. Not every message, but enough to matter. NSA was reading encrypted traffic that Moscow believed was secure. The intelligence harvest was about to begin. The breakthrough NSA codenamed Tractor started with a mistake in Moscow. On April 14, 1962, a Soviet cipher clerk at the Foreign Ministry encrypted two diplomatic cables using the same one-time pad sheet, a violation of protocol that should never have happened. The messages went to Soviet embassies in Cairo and Havana, routine diplomatic traffic about trade negotiations and visa requests. Harvest detected the pad reuse within 6 hours. Rosen's differential cryptanalysis circuits compared the two messages and extracted the encryption key. Once NSA had that key, they could decrypt both messages completely. More importantly, they could identify the specific pad sheet the clerk had used. Sheet number 3847 from a batch distributed to Soviet embassies in February. If that clerk made one mistake, he might make others. Harvest began scanning months of archived intercepts, looking for any other messages encrypted with keys from the same pad batch. It found 47 more. By May 1962, NSA was reading Soviet diplomatic communications across 14 embassies. The intelligence revealed negotiations Moscow was conducting with Egypt over military equipment sales, internal Soviet assessments of Fidel Castro's reliability, and concerns about Chinese criticism of Soviet foreign policy. The decrypted traffic went directly to the White House Situation Room. The breakthrough expanded through summer 1962. Harvest identified more pad reuse errors, more cipher clerk mistakes, more statistical anomalies in Soviet encryption procedures. By August, NSA had penetrated diplomatic communications from 23 Soviet embassies. The system Rosen built was doing exactly what Friedman had envisioned, breaking codes at scale in real time, fast enough for the intelligence to matter. Then came Cuba. In October 1962, American U-2 reconnaissance flights discovered Soviet missile installations under construction 90 miles from Florida. President Kennedy needed to understand Moscow's intentions. Were the missiles defensive or offensive? Was Khrushchev prepared to escalate? What were Soviet military commanders telling their political leadership? Harvest provided answers. The decrypted Soviet diplomatic traffic showed confusion in Moscow. Khrushchev's foreign ministry hadn't been fully informed about the missile deployment timeline. Soviet diplomats were receiving contradictory instructions about how to respond to American inquiries. The communications revealed a Soviet leadership that was improvising, not executing a carefully planned strategy. That intelligence helped Kennedy assess that Khrushchev might be willing to negotiate rather than risk war. Throughout the 13-day crisis, Harvest processed Soviet intercepts continuously. NSA cryptologists worked 12-hour shifts, feeding encrypted traffic into the machine and analyzing its output. The decrypted messages gave American negotiators insight into Soviet red lines, what Moscow would accept, what would trigger escalation. When Kennedy and Khrushchev reached agreement on October 28, 1962, Harvest had decrypted the Soviet diplomatic cable, informing their embassy in Washington of Moscow's decision before the official notification reached the White House. For 18 months, from April 1962 through October 1963, NSA maintained its access to Soviet diplomatic communications. Harvest processed roughly 25,000 encrypted messages during that period, extracting intelligence about Soviet policy toward Cuba, China, Europe, and the developing world. The system proved that specialized computing could give American intelligence a decisive advantage in the Cold War. But the advantage was temporary. Cryptographic breakthroughs always are. Soviet security officers eventually discovered that their communications were being read, exactly how remains classified. And in November 1963, Moscow changed its encryption procedures. New one-time pads, new distribution protocols, new cipher discipline. Within weeks, the flow of decrypted Soviet traffic dried up. Harvest was still running, still processing intercepts, but the messages it had been breaking were suddenly secure again. Rosen would have to adapt. The loss hit NSA hard in November 1963. 1 week, Harvest was decrypting hundreds of Soviet diplomatic messages daily. The next week, it was producing nothing. Soviet cipher clerks had switched to new one-time pad systems with stricter handling procedures. They destroyed used pad sheets immediately instead of filing them. They implemented double checks to prevent the reuse errors that had given NSA its opening. The mathematical vulnerabilities Rosen had exploited disappeared. NSA's analysts tried to determine exactly what had compromised the operation. Had the Soviets detected some electronic signature from the decryption process? Had a Soviet intelligence officer noticed that American diplomats seemed unusually well informed about Moscow's negotiating positions? Had there been a mole inside Fort Meade who warned Moscow? The investigation never produced definitive answers. Soviet security procedures simply improved, which suggested they knew something was wrong, even if they didn't know precisely how NSA was reading their traffic. Rosen faced a decision. He could try adapting Harvest to attack the new Soviet cipher systems, or he could accept that Tractor's operational window had closed and focus on other targets. He chose adaptation. The new Soviet procedures were more secure, but they weren't perfect. No human encryption system ever is. His team spent early 1964 reconfiguring Harvest's circuits. The machine's architecture had been optimized for detecting one-time pad reuse and exploiting cipher clerk errors. Now, Rosen needed it to find different vulnerabilities. Soviet communications used multiple layers. Some messages were encrypted twice, first with a one-time pad and then with a secondary code system. If NSA couldn't break the pad, maybe they could break the code. Rosen designed new pattern matching circuits that analyzed Soviet code groups, the 4-digit and 5-digit number sequences that represented words or phrases in encrypted messages. Even when the underlying encryption was secure, the code groups sometimes revealed information through traffic analysis. Messages with similar length and structure were likely discussing similar topics. Messages sent to multiple recipients simultaneously were probably routine administrative traffic rather than sensitive intelligence. By analyzing these patterns, Harvest could at least categorize Soviet communications, even when it couldn't decrypt them. By mid-1964, the machine was breaking some Soviet military communications that used older, less sophisticated cipher systems, not diplomatic traffic anymore, but tactical radio communications between Soviet naval vessels, coordination messages between air defense units, routine administrative traffic from Red Army facilities in Eastern Europe. Lower-level intelligence, but still valuable. NSA was reading Soviet submarine patrol schedules, maintenance reports from bomber bases, personnel transfer orders, the kind of operational detail that helped American intelligence track Soviet military capabilities. Harvest's success against these secondary targets validated Rosen's architectural approach. Because the machine was purpose-built for cryptanalysis rather than general computing, he could reconfigure its specialized circuits for new attack strategies without rebuilding the entire system. Commercial computers like the IBM 7094 would have required complete reprogramming, months of work writing new software. Harvest just needed new circuit configurations, which Rosen's team could implement in weeks. The system ran continuously through the mid-1960s, processing hundreds of thousands of intercepted Soviet communications. Some it broke, most it couldn't. But the ones it decrypted provided intelligence that influenced American policy decisions throughout the Cold War's most dangerous years. And Rosen kept refining it, kept adapting to Soviet countermeasures, kept finding new vulnerabilities to exploit. By 1967, Harvest had been operational for 5 years, an extraordinary lifespan for a computer in that era. But NSA was already planning its successor. The agency had learned what specialized computing could accomplish. Now they wanted something even more powerful. Rosen's architectural principles became doctrine at NSA. When the agency began planning Harvest's successor in 1967, they didn't consider buying commercial mainframes from IBM or Control Data Corporation. They went directly to specialized design, custom-built systems optimized exclusively for signals intelligence and cryptanalysis. Harvest had proven that purpose-built computing could deliver capabilities commercial machines couldn't match. The next-generation system, codenamed Lodestone, entered development in 1968 following Rosen's core concepts: parallel processing for testing multiple cryptographic hypotheses simultaneously, streaming architecture for real-time analysis of communications intercepts, and specialized circuits optimized for specific mathematical operations. Lodestone would be faster and more powerful than Harvest, but it followed the same fundamental philosophy that general-purpose versatility was the enemy of specialized excellence. NSA's approach influenced the entire intelligence community. The Central Intelligence Agency began developing its own specialized computing systems for processing satellite imagery and communications intelligence. The Defense Intelligence Agency built custom computers for analyzing intercepted telemetry from Soviet missile tests. Even the National Reconnaissance Office, which operated America's spy satellites, commissioned purpose-built systems for processing the massive data streams their cameras generated. Rosen's insight that you could gain decisive advantage through architectural specialization became standard practice. His influence extended beyond government. The concept of application in specific integrated circuits, chips designed to perform one task exceptionally well rather than many tasks adequately, emerged from the same philosophy Rosen had pioneered at NSA. By the 1980s, specialized processors were everywhere. Graphics chips optimized for rendering images, signal processing chips designed for telecommunications, cryptographic accelerators built into secure communication systems. The entire computing industry had learned what Rosen demonstrated in 1962, that specialized architecture could outperform general-purpose systems by orders of magnitude. Inside NSA, Rosen continued refining cryptanalytic computing through the 1970s. He worked on systems that used parallel processing to factor large numbers, a technique that would later become crucial for breaking RSA encryption. He developed streaming architectures that could process terabytes of intercepted communications daily as satellite technology and global telecommunications expanded the volume of signals intelligence. He trained a generation of NSA engineers in the principles of specialized computer design. Harvest itself ran until 1976, 14 years of continuous operation that made it one of the longest-serving computers in history. By the time NSA finally decommissioned it, the system had processed millions of encrypted communications and contributed to cryptanalytic breakthroughs that remained classified decades later. The machine weighed 7,000 pounds and occupied an entire room, but it had changed how intelligence agencies thought about computing. The architectural concepts Rosen pioneered in the 1950s still shape NSA's systems today. Modern NSA supercomputers follow his principle of purpose-built design: massively parallel processors optimized for cryptanalysis, specialized circuits for pattern matching and statistical analysis, streaming architectures that process communications intercepts in real time. The hardware is far more advanced than Harvest's transistorized circuits, but the fundamental approach remains the same. By the time Rosen retired from NSA in 1989, the agency operated dozens of specialized computing systems based on principles he had established. None of them were general-purpose computers. All of them were designed to do one thing extraordinarily well: break codes. That single-minded focus on mission-specific excellence, that willingness to reject commercial solutions in favor of custom architectures, that conviction that specialized hardware could provide decisive intelligence advantage. Those were Rosen's contributions, and they reshaped how the intelligence community approached computing. But almost no one outside NSA knew his name. Leo Rosen died in 2002 at age 77. His obituary in the Princeton Alumni Weekly mentioned his mathematics doctorate, his career at a government agency, and his surviving family. It didn't mention Harvest. It didn't mention that he had built the first supercomputer designed specifically for cryptanalysis. It didn't mention that his work had given American intelligence a decisive advantage during the most dangerous years of the Cold War. Everything that mattered about his professional life remained classified. The computing industry celebrated other pioneers during those decades. John von Neumann received credit for establishing computer architecture principles. Alan Turing was recognized for his theoretical foundations of computing and his World War II code-breaking work at Bletchley Park. Grace Hopper became famous for developing COBOL. J. Pressman Eckert and John Mauchly were honored for building ENIAC. These were legitimate accomplishments, properly celebrated. But Rosen's work remained hidden behind NSA's classification wall. The irony was that Rosen had arguably done more to advance specialized computing than anyone in the 1950s and 1960s. While commercial computer companies were building general-purpose machines that could perform many tasks adequately, Rosen proved that purpose-built architecture could deliver capabilities that versatile systems couldn't match. His insight that you could gain orders of magnitude performance improvements by optimizing hardware for specific applications shaped everything from graphics processors to cryptographic accelerators to signal processing chips. But because his work was classified, those later innovations developed independently, without credit to the principles he had established. NSA began declassifying information about Harvest in 2013, more than a decade after Rosen's death. The released documents revealed the system's architecture, its cryptanalytic capabilities, and its role in breaking Soviet communications during the early 1960s. Computer historians finally understood what Rosen had built and why it mattered. Academic papers analyzing Harvest's specialized design began appearing in journals. But by then, the man who had designed it wasn't around to see his work recognized. The declassification also revealed how close NSA came to losing the Harvest project entirely. In 1959, during the system's construction, congressional budget reviewers questioned whether the agency needed such an expensive custom computer when IBM was selling commercial mainframes for far less money. NSA had to justify the specialized approach without revealing what the machine would actually do. William Friedman testified in closed session that general-purpose computers couldn't meet the agency's requirements, but he couldn't explain why. The project survived, but barely. Rosen's contribution illustrates the hidden cost of classification in scientific and engineering fields. His architectural innovations were genuinely groundbreaking: parallel processing, streaming data analysis, application-specific optimization, but they remained invisible to the broader computing community for 50 years. Other engineers eventually rediscovered these principles through independent work, but the field might have advanced faster if Rosen's insights had been available. Classification protected American intelligence advantage, but it also meant burying contributions that could have accelerated technological progress. The engineers who worked with Rosen at NSA understood what he had accomplished. They built careers on the principles he established. They taught his architectural concepts to new generations of NSA computer scientists. Inside Fort Meade, Rosen was recognized as the founder of specialized intelligence computing. But outside those classified facilities, his name meant nothing. Today, every intelligence agency in the world uses purpose-built computing systems for cryptanalysis. The specialized architectures, the parallel processing, the streaming analysis of intercepted communications, these are standard approaches that trace directly to Rosen's work in the 1950s. He created the template. He proved it worked. And for most of his life, no one outside NSA could know.